Hi, everyone. I'm Alex Usher, and this is the World of Higher Education podcast. Back in late 2023, a little-known libertarian by the name of Javier Milei was elected president of Argentina with a strong mandate to conquer that country's hyperinflation. His strategy for doing so was pretty straightforward. Freeze public spending, which would mean a big loss in real terms until inflation came down, and then let the free market do the rest. That was easier said than done. Milei lacked a majority in Congress, and all of the legacy parties had some reason to try and preserve the status quo. But more or less, Milei got his way, and the public sector, including public universities, have had to shrink enormously as a result. Falling budgets, cratering salaries, the lot. But now the opposition is starting to gain strength. Over the northern summer, Congress passed a bill meant to roughly double state spending on public higher education. Last week, predictably, Milei vetoed the law. We can probably expect a season of protests and strikes to ensue. Returning to the show today to discuss all this is Marcelo Rabossi of the Universidad Torcuato Di Tella in Buenos Aires. He joined the podcast 18 months ago at the outset of Milei's term to discuss what the president's agenda was likely to have in store for the higher education sector. Today, he's with us to talk about how the system is surviving what amounts to a massive cut in real pesos and what the next few months look like as tensions mount between the president and the opposition. A particular interest, I think, is where we talk about how, despite Milei's affinity to the U.S. hard right, he's avoided Trumpian tactics like targeted cutbacks through research rescissions and outright institutional extortion. But enough from me. Let's hear from Marcelo. Marcelo, when we last spoke in, I think, January 2024, Javier Milei was a newly elected president at the head of a new political movement, La Libertad Avanza. He didn't have a majority in Congress, still doesn't. He was elected on a mandate to stop hyperinflation, but his appeal wasn't just about tighter money, right? He was a libertarian who wanted to shrink the size of government enormously, which is in some ways quite a revolutionary idea in Argentina. Generally speaking, how has his first year and a half in office gone? Is inflation down? Has the size of government shrunk?
Well, Javier Milei's presidency promised from the very beginning, and even during his presidential campaign, radical changes to literally crush hyperinflation, and doing this by reducing government spending and opening the economy. The result were that inflation dropped substantially. For example, December 2023, monthly inflation peaked at 25%.
Monthly inflation.
Monthly inflation, exactly. And now is around 2% for 3 consecutive months. This is largely credited to Milei aggressive austerity measures and a very tight monetary policy. He significantly cut federal spendings and restored market dynamics. It's also true that poverty has declined from 54% in early 2024 to 32% in early 2025. On the other hand, we have to say that economic activity has stagnated and retirees have lost the purchasing power of their pensions. So that is the dark side of the economic plan of Milei.
How has he been able to achieve his agenda without a majority in Congress? Like, what's the dynamic there? Does he strike deals with conservative parties, or does the presidency give him some ability to rule by decree? How do you get things done when you're a minority president?
That is a great question because I guess that it's one of the first party in power that has minority in both chambers of Congress. Milei has rest on, as you say, on emergency executive decrees to bypass legislative opposition or blockages and to implement deep reforms. Early on, Milei strategies deals with strategic deals with conservative parties, particularly the party of former President Macri and the Radical Civic Union Party. And these strategies helped him to pass the late bases in 2004 that was a foundational reform to deregulate the economy. However, the strategy had limits. Now it faces growing resistance even from former allies. Internal division and shifting loyalties have made these alliances fragile.
Yeah.
By mid-2025, even some conservative legislators began distancing from Milei's more extreme measures and aggressive behavior. So I would say that Milei has governed through a mix of executive power, tactical alliances, public pressure, but is losing that benefits.
So my understanding is that Milei's approach to reducing expenditure and inflation has been simply to freeze spending on government departments. And, I know inflation is lower now than it was 2 years ago, but it's still reasonably high. And so inflation just erodes the value of the spending. How has this affected higher education? How big has the cut been to higher education in real terms, that is after inflation? And is higher education different from other social sectors? So, presumably you'd have the same dynamics with hospitals and other social services. Is higher education being targeted for bigger reductions or no?
First, you are absolutely right on that. Spending freezes across all public areas. You name it, education, health, infrastructure, and has been his primary tool to combat inflation. But as you noted, when inflation remained high, even if it's slowing, frozen budgets imply budget reduction in public appropriation in real terms. Regarding higher education, I give you some numbers. In 2024, for example, funding for Argentina's public universities fell around 30% in real terms.
Wow.
And by 2025, the projected budget for university is more or less 35, 36 lower than in 2023.
Mm-hmm.
That is according to some analysis and study that I have made. For example, faculty members, 80% of higher education spending goes to salaries in Argentina.
Mm-hmm.
And that dropped around 35%. And also capital expenses for infrastructure literally collapsed. But not only state appropriation to national universities saw real decrease, education overall suffered more than a 30% in real cuts between 2023-25. School teachers training, for example, and technology programs are down to 40%, and early childhood education infrastructure down to 60%. Scholarship for low-income students also decreased around 40%. I have to say that schools are funded at the provincial level.
Right.
So the impact of the national cuts down didn't have that huge impact that had in universities that are financed at the national level. But again, university education as a whole has been one of the hardest hit sectors. So the freeze strategy, as I call it, has helped Milei achieve fiscal surpluses and reduce inflation, but it comes at the cost of shrinking real investment in the future of the country.
Right. So the president is sometimes seen as, Argentina's Trump. I mean, I think that's sort of his international reputation. He certainly has his admirers on the U.S. far right. Mm-hmm. Elon Musk copied the president with the routine with the chainsaw and attacking public finances. And I don't get the sense that Milei is a friend of higher education. He rants about woke intellectuals and those kinds of things. So you see that kind of right-wing lines of sympathy with the American right. But I don't get the sense that he's copied Trump in terms of silencing particular lines of research or picking fights with individual universities. So apart from the financial cuts, which, maybe can be defended purely on anti-inflationary grounds, what's the relationship been between Milei and the higher education sector?
Unlike Trump, Milei hasn't gone after specific research, agendas, or individual institutions. Milei hasn't interfered with academic freedom, for example. There has been no restriction on curricula or no bans on gender studies or climate research, and no attempt to control universities' governance, for example.
Mm-hmm.
His approach has been more structural, I would say, than punctual to a certain institution, although the UBA, the University of Buenos Aires, the largest and most important of the system, has been the main target for Milei, particularly because, as I say, this is a more visible institution.
Mm-hmm.
I can add that some of his initial ideas that of replacing direct public university funding with vouchers remain theoretical provocations, I would say, rather than something with a real support and has no chances to be implemented. So while Milei's behavior toward higher education is hostile, I would say, there's nothing close to institutional repression because his obsession is economy,
right,
to control inflation.
We're going to take a short break. We'll be right back. And we're back. Okay, so a second ago, I think you had talked about a 30% decline in real terms for university support, maybe a little bit higher than that if you go end of 25 to end of 23. How does a university deal with a cut of 33%? It's like, what kind of decisions do universities have to make in order to keep the doors open in conditions of austerity like that? And what have been the consequences of those decisions?
Well, first, universities reacted in order to survive. No, so I would say they are operating in a survival mode.
Mhm.
Now, in this scenario, universities have had to freeze salaries, delay infrastructure repairs, and cut back on research funding. So they were forced to adapt themselves to this new reality by, for example, shorten semesters, reduce course offering,
Mhm.
and postpone new programs. Some campuses also have merged departments or cut non-essential services, as it's happening now in the UVA.
Yeah.
So to give you an idea in monetary terms and why this fiscal restrictive policy has hardly impacted national universities, it's fundamental to know that between 80 to 90% of their total income are national government funds. They receive that fund from national government. So remember, Argentina, undergraduate education charge no tuition fees.
Right.
And undergrad students represent more than 90% of a total student body of more than 2 million students enrolled in national institutions. On the other hand, historically, public universities in Argentina do not have the tradition of fundraising, although some universities have begun to move into that direction, to collect some private money from
Mhm.
private donors.
Mhm. And surely that gives, those kinds of cutbacks would make private universities in Argentina more attractive, right? So Argentina doesn't have a huge private sector. It's not like Chile or Brazil. I think it's about 80% of the students are in the public system. But have private universities seen an opportunity here? Are they taking advantage of these cuts to sort of tout, the benefits of paying tuition and offering something more complete than the public sector?
Well, as you say, Argentina is, as I always say, the private sector is more tolerated than stimulated, as the case in Brazil and Chile. So nowadays there are around 60 private universities in the whole country with around 400,000 undergrad students. And I would say that historically they have largely avoided the political confrontations. They're neutral in general. The place to play politics is the public sector mainly. So unlike the national institution, they haven't been cast as ideological enemies or targets for Milei. And this has allowed them to operate with less social or political confrontation. On the financial side, I would say that the private sector largely depends on tuition fees. On average, 90% of their income comes from that source. So decreased public fund has not been an issue for them, given that there are neither public loans nor scholarship from private institutions. But lately, and this is a novelty, there has been a rumor about scholarship, public scholarship for private universities.
Okay.
But I would say that financially speaking, they are in a reasonably good shape. This has allowed them to maintain operation, salaries, and infrastructure in a way they look relatively resilient. But
Yeah.
you're also right. With public universities cutting programs, freezing salaries, and facing potential strikes, private universities now appear as more stable entities, unpredictable for students and families. For those who can afford tuition, maybe private institution may now seem like a real option.
Right. Well, and the public universities obviously have been fighting back, over the past year and a half. I mean, there have been, I've lost count of the number of strikes or protests or, public opposition. And what's interesting is that just these past few months during the Northern Hemisphere summer, your winter, Congress considered a bill to stabilize university finances. And if I understand correctly, they mandated a floor on funding equal to a certain percentage of GDP. That law passed about a month ago. What was this bill and how did it pass?
The goal of this law, the goal was to increase Argentina university budget from around 0.4% of GDP to 1 0.5 GDP
Wow.
in the next 5 years. So that's a lot. Beginning next year, 2026, with 1% of GDP, historically, spending, so public spending or public appropriation to the public sector was around 0.6 up to a peak of 1%.
Yeah.
But in general, 0.8, I would say.
Okay.
But the proposal is intended, yes, to replace the funding law voted by the government in 2024. The bill was introduced in Congress by rectors of the 55, 56 national universities, with the support, of course, of unions and student organizations. This university law proposes updating the budget allocations for accumulated inflation for the 2023-2024 period and reinforcing faculty salaries starting in December 2023 with monthly update based on the Consumer Price Index.
So, but let's talk about what happens politically here. So both houses of Congress, I guess, passed the law, and Milei has vetoed it on September 10th, I think.
Uh-huh.
How does this get resolved at this point? Is there what happens politically to the bill from here on in?
You are right about the veto. It's his political tool, no? Given that he has no majority in both chambers. University unions, students, and education advocates have already staged, as I say, protests, strike, demonstrations, and more demonstrations are expected, especially around Congress. The veto will increase and escalate tensions, as I say, between Milei and the education sector, and it's becoming a rallying point for the opposition. In short, the next weeks will be critical in my point of view. If Congress can't override the veto, university will remain under severe financial strain, and the political pressure on Milei will intensify. So either way, this is more than a budget fight. The opposition say it's a battle over the future of the public education in Argentina.
Mm-hmm. So President Milei has another 2 years and 3 months to go, I guess, in his mandate. What's your best guess about how higher education is going to fare between now and then? What does the Argentinian system look like at the end of 2027?
Yep, you are right. We have 2 years ahead. It's difficult to predict the future in Argentina, although some would say, expect a new crisis, and you'll be right. As we have said, despite lacking congressional majority, Milei pushed through major reforms via executive decrees. That was his political tool. His confrontational style has kept him in the spotlight, but also sparked resistance from traditional parties, far left, conservatives, and even moderate liberals. Whether this incipient economic stabilization will translate into long-term growth and, as a consequence, certain political support and less social pressure remains the big question. If he wins in the next legislative election this coming October, probably he will maintain his firm stance, continuing vetoing, and I don't see any major changes. If the economy grows, there will certainly be some money to calm the situation down, but not enough to achieve what the veto law proposes, which is to double in relative terms funding for national universities in the short or medium run. I think that's a kind of utopia, even if the country managed to emerge from economic depression.
Yeah.
But if he loses by a wide margin, the pressure will be enormous, turning into a kind of vicious circle that will prevent the country from easily escaping from its economic stagnation. Keep in mind that the only way for university to receive more funding is for the country to grow. And if conflict increases, investors will postpone their investment decisions, and in such scenario, that will be no winner. But again, public universities in Argentina are more than just educational institutions. They are a symbol of social mobility and national pride. And Milei's veto of a bill that would have increased university funding and staff salaries will trigger widespread outrage that will unite students, faculty, unions, and even the political oppositions. In fact, new public demonstrations are now on their way for these coming weeks, months, or maybe this coming 2 years after his mandate finished.
Lots to keep an eye on. Marcelo Rabossi, thank you so much for being with us today.
That's my pleasure. Thank you so much.
And it just remains for me to thank our excellent producers, Samantha Pufek and Tiffany McLennan, and you, our listeners and readers, for joining us once again. If you have any questions or comments about today's episode, or if you have any suggestions for future ones, please do not hesitate to write us at podcast@higheredstrategy.com. Join us next week when our guest will be Yale University's Zach Bleemer. He's a professor of economics there, and he's just co-written a fantastic new paper called Changes in the College Mobility Pipeline Since 1900. We'll be talking about some of that report's surprising findings. Bye for now.